Right, I'll start assembling these components. I usually use some synthetic grease to act as assembly grease to hold things together while I'm getting these pieces together, because they are inclined to all fall apart otherwise. Now, there's almost always a scratch across this chrome piece that points towards number 1 on your dial. If you don't get it round the right way, you'll find you have a film advance which locks at frame number 21 or 22. Not very helpful. Well, that didn't stay stuck. It still didn't. Hang on, I'm going to give another go at that. Why did that not stay stuck? That's better. The wavy washer. Just about keep you in camera if we're very lucky. Wavy washer goes in there. There's our screw, there's our star washer, or our replacement star washer. I'll just put the screw on my special driver. And taking this, I now have to get that on the top of the camera. This is going not well. Rotate that clockwise. I can hear that ratchet clicking into position. Run the screw down. It sounds pretty good. Let's see what happens. Have we got frame counter? We have got frame counter. That looks pretty good to me. We'll tighten that screw up. Does it lock when it gets to number 1? Oh, it skipped right past it. I'm listening for the click. There it is. That frame counter spring may be slightly too long, the tip of it. It certainly does lock, but it might not lock at quite the right place. The frame counter is certainly working. Yeah, it's not quite moving far enough. Yeah, it doesn't, it's not quite long enough to move things all the full distance. It doesn't quite bring that notch at number 1 into position. Well, yeah, yeah. And by the time it completes the stroke, it's moved it on too far, so it doesn't actually latch. That's not moving at all there now. There's frame counter's not good. I don't want to replace that spring because springs are few and far between. I can probably find one, but I don't want to replace these things unnecessarily. Yeah, it's just not quite moving far enough. I'll have to see what I can do about that. This tab here, that's what moves that frame counter spring at the end of each advanced stroke. Now that's already been mucked with. Someone's already bent that right down. It can't be bent any further down. I'm going to have to see if I can put that back where it began its life and see how that behaves. It would have been almost vertical here at one stage. Now it's at about a 45-degree angle. Right, some investigation in order. All the problems with that frame counter relate to the frame counter spring. It's been repaired, but it hasn't been repaired particularly well. And the problem is this, that the little tag on the end, which is the bit that does the work, here is too short. Here is a new part. And here you have, that's probably 3 millimeters long, that piece. Here we're short at least 0.5 millimeter, possibly more. It certainly doesn't come out far enough, which means that it doesn't reliably engage with the ratchet wheel to the same extent, so it doesn't push the ratchet wheel round quite so far because it's just not pressing all the way into the ratchet wheel. And so as a result, this doesn't reliably move things, and it certainly doesn't reliably move the ratchet wheel into the number 1 position where the frame counter locks. So I can try one thing first. I can try reshaping the end of this spring, though I have to say my chances of success there are probably 1 in 100. Or I can just replace the spring with a new one, which is very expensive. So I've proved that a new one will work, and I have one in here at the moment. I'll zoom you out a bit. I have one in here, and that works nicely. And when it reaches number 1, the film advanced locks exactly as it should do. So I've proven that the problem is with that part. And I know it's useless in its current state. So I've probably got nothing to lose by attempting to bend that into position. And so that's what I'll try to do. Of course, it might just snap straight off. I'll try that back in the camera and see if there's any improvement. Well, unfortunately, that repaired part is just not good enough. It would never work correctly. It's just fundamentally flawed in that the little tab on the end is short by somewhere between 0.5 and 1 millimeter of where it needs to be. And so it just can't move the ratchet wheel round far enough in order to allow the frame counter to lock in at the end of the film mark at number 1. And just simply swapping that component for a known good one, a new part, everything works nicely. So that's what we've got at the moment. So the camera body, as you can see, is all back together, nice and clean, nice and tidy. And the only thing that this camera lacks is shutter and lens assembly, so I'd better get on to doing that. I'll start assembling the diaphragm into the shutter case. Everything here is clean and ready to go. So I start here each of the diaphragm blades drops into a hole in the plate. The blades only go in one way round. The rivet that I'm dropping into the plate here is closer to the centre line of the blade. The rivet on the other end of the blade, which is pointing upwards, is closest to the outside edge of the blade. And if you mix them up, you're going to have a bad day. So I lay my blades out all the same way so that I can pick them up and conveniently place them. Now I've got to pull back the earlier blades to uncover the holes for the last few. Unlike shutter blades, which are simply stacked on top of each other, diaphragm blades are interleaved. Each blade is under the next one at one end and over the next one at the other. Last one. Alright, now I've got to lift these blades back over the top there without disturbing anything. That looks good. Now the moving plate, this is the plate that opens and closes the diaphragm. Only goes on in one position, or it'll go on in multiple positions, but they won't do you any good. I'm going to get these pivots up through the plate. That looks good. And then fit the case, and the case, the plate ends up screwed to the case so it holds all this together. Turn that over, flip my jig over, get this lined up with the screw holes. One of the three screws here is a countersunk head screw. So you've got to get that positioned in the right spot. Not doing that screw up tight yet. Now the two plain screws can go in. Just turn these screws up very lightly. It looks promising, but I'm not entirely sure that everything has stayed correctly positioned in the fixed and moving plate. Right, so we can take that off. I'm going to have a look now. All my rivets, all the pivot points are all pointing up correctly there on that plate. Of course we can't really see on this plate, but if I move this I can see whether the blades form a neat circle and nothing is getting left behind. So that's good. So I can tighten my three screws up now. Don't go mad tightening those screws up because they're only going into quite thin aluminium, and you will risk stripping them out. Yeah, that moves quite well, and I can put the setting lever on the back now. So before I do that, I'll give that a wipe with some molybdenum paste. And this goes that way up, and there are two holes in this fixed plate. If you line up everything with that, you can see right through to the settings lever and get the two shoulder screws in place. That was one. That's the other. I'll just check this. That moves smoothly, and I'll tighten those two screws up. I'm supporting this on the wooden block from underneath, so I'm not bending anything. Just make sure those screws are nipped up. Again, do not over tighten those. It's not uncommon for them to be stripped out. If they're stripped out, there is an answer, and the answer is you have to rivet them over, and you do strike that from time to time, which of course makes it very difficult for the next poor bugger who comes along and wants to service it. So there's our shutter case with the diaphragm all installed, ready to go. Mechanism plate next. So here I've got the mechanism plate. This is all clean, and it lacks a couple of bits and pieces, so we'll put the blade actuating ring in place. The retaining ring. This has a rivet on it, so it only fits into the plate in one position. There are four tiny fixing screws, one of them's longer than the other. And if you're taking it apart, you take note of where the long one came from. I know from experience it comes from over here. It's fairly common practice for people who are less familiar with a particular shutter to mark the plate where the longest screw goes. So you often find there might be a little check mark here next to where the long screw goes. I don't see anything there, which means that whoever serviced it previously either made note in a different way or was simply familiar with the shutter and didn't need to mark it. That was the long screw. I'll get these other three screws snugged down. Check the movement of the blade actuating ring, and that's nice and smooth. On the other side we have the lever that swings the blade actuating ring here. So I'll wipe some molybdenum paste through the pivot point and through the slotted hole that couples to the pin on the blade actuating ring. And you need very little indeed. You're just leaving a slightly dirty mark when you're using molybdenum paste. That's all that's required. Tighten that up. Check that that moves freely. That all looks good. And here's its return spring. The action is nice and snappy. Now the mechanism, the retard gear train here and the blade actuating ring, I want to lubricate with a bit of graphite powder at this stage. Now I've got some graphite powder loose here in this container because this is where I normally do this job. I'll just drop some onto the blade actuating ring there and then work the blade actuating ring backwards and forwards to work that graphite powder into the surfaces that come together, and that's usually all that's required. Now the retard gear train, likewise I'm going to lubricate that with a bit of graphite powder. I'll just drop some on there, hold back the pallets with my finger here, swing the arm in and out to work the gears. Knock off all the excess, and I'll just go and blow away the excess powder now. With that all done, I can fit the shutter blades and fit the case in place. So I'll unhook that spring, swing this out into the blade's open position, and fit the shutter blades in place. Got them all handily here on a piece of paper, and I might be able to handle that without dropping everything everywhere. The first blade has an extra hole. The extra hole serves no other purpose than to show you that that's the first blade. Otherwise the blades are identical. And our first blade goes here. Our second blade goes here. Unlike diaphragm blades, shutter blades just lay on top of each other. So there is a first and a last blade. And because they lay on top of each other, it means that they can completely overlap to close, which you can't do with the diaphragm. Okay, so that's all good. Now it just needs the case put in place, which only goes on in one direction, and handily with this shutter you can see there's a little rectangular square cutout there. There's likewise a cutout on the case. That's where the flash contact's going to go. But it means that we can see exactly where we need to be. It can't be far away. Here we are. There. The case should just slip down over there, sometimes it doesn't. I'll get the 3 screws in place and I'll just run them down lightly. There's always a possibility one of the blades jumped off its pivots while you were fitting the case over the top, and you don't want to end up with a blade trapped between one of the pivots and the case and end up getting damaged. Right, so let's see if they close. They do. You can hook the return spring into place. That's all good. And now I can tighten those 3 screws. So that's all our blades cleaned and back fitted in the case. Now I can start assembling the mechanism on the mechanism plate, or the control gear.